Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And 81 years ago today, troopers of the 50 Deuce and other units were in the middle of a 5 or 6 day battle for the small market town of Carentan at the foot of the Carentan here in Normandy. With a forthcoming Osprey book on the campaign or the battle, Stephen Zaloga returns to explain all. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Stephen. How are you today?
Good afternoon. Doing fine.
Well, I feel like the viewers have missed out on the fact we were having just a nice little conversation about Normandy and campaigns and stuff. And to kind of help explain what we're going to be talking about, there's still a lot to be said about the Normandy campaign. D-Day has sort of been covered, but even just a few days after D-Day, the number of books that really cover those inland battles, they drop off a cliff a bit, doesn't it?
Oh, exactly. Yeah. The June 6 books, the D-Day itself, yeah, fine, and maybe sort of slide into June 7th just to kind of establish where everyone was after the landings. But yeah, the battles and campaigns afterwards, yeah, until you get deeper into the Normandy campaign, the Operation Cobra, the fighting around Caen, the Falaise Gap battles. But the week or two after D-Day, yeah, there's a surprising gap in coverage.
And I will get into, I feel personally that 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th period of June is where everyone's hoping that the original schedule will be maintained because D-Day has been a success. Most objectives have been taken. So no one's quite ready to admit it is going to sort of devolve a bit into an attritional phase, and there is going to be a bit of a grudge match, and it's going to get a little bit, not bogged down as such, but not quite the strides expecting. So I think there's the Germans can't win, but I think there are some sort of juicy battles over those 3 or 4 days where if a few of them had gone the other way, wheel might have got a bit wobbly on the Allied cart, so to speak. But we'll get into that as we go on. So, Steve, just tell me when to nudge on the slides, and folks, fire away with questions. But you know what it's like with Mr. Zaloga. I think everything will be covered as we go along because that's what he's good at. So, the Battle of Carentan, 1944. Over to you, sir.
Okay, let's jump ahead. Go to the next map. I put this up just so that everybody's familiar with the geography. This is the Carentan Peninsula. The critical operational objective is the port of Cherbourg up in the north. And just to establish where this is relative to the D-Day beaches, you can see Utah Beach down in the lower right and Omaha Beach even further to the right. And Carentan is down there, down in the lower right side in the area where the Vire and Douve River estuaries are. So that just establishes where we're talking about. And here's the German side of the picture. This is an OKW map from May 1944, immediately before the D-Day landings. What happens in this period, and I'm not going to go into great detail. You can go to Neil Henkman's book to see about German forces on the Carentan at this period. But the big issue is that there was a change of policy in the later part of May. The peninsula is reinforced because Cherbourg is viewed as being a significant strategic objective, a potential strategic objective for the Allies. The critical change is that the 91 Luftland Division, Air Landing Division, is placed in behind the 709th, near where the future Utah Beach is going to be. And associated with that deployment is Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, which is going to be the primary German combatant in this battle that we're going to be talking about. They were officially subordinated to 91st Luftland, but as we'll see, they get separated because of the U.S. airborne operation, and they fight the battle pretty much themselves in the Carentan area, reinforced by elements from some of the other units around there. Okay,
before we move on, I just want to get your assessment of how you, as a kind of military analyst, in a different world kind of thing, how you would sum up the 91st Division, because as Niels, and I was with Niels yesterday, I'll be with him again on Friday, they get sort of announced as like a fast reaction squad, anti-airborne. How would you assess them for the uninitiated out there? What would you describe them as?
They're a very odd unit. The German army had created another Luftland division back in 1940 that was never used as intended. It's intended, as the name implies, an air landing division. It's not an airborne division in the sense of using paratroopers. It's designed to be landed either using Ju-52 transports or the Gotha transport gliders. And it was designed as a potential fast reaction force to various military crises. And so there were several crises that were considered, for example, a surprise Allied landing in Denmark, or an Allied landing, a modest Allied landing in Norway, or something like that. So the German army decided we need something that we can use to rapidly insert some troops.
Yeah.
If the Allies use their airborne capabilities or their amphibious capabilities to stage some small amphibious operation. Of course, as you can see here, they're not used that way. Their configuration is actually more like a German mountain division, like a Gebirgsunit. So if the viewers are familiar with Gebirgsdivision, then they have some sense of how the 91st is organized.
Okay, thank you. Brilliant. We'll move on.
A geographic point that I'm going to make is these days Carentan is called Carentan les Marais, marais meaning marshes, and this is going to be important in the tactical conduct of the fighting. The area is naturally inclined towards flooding, especially in the spring. The German army decides to extend the flooding into the summer months and to expand the flooded areas. The map in the lower right shows the plan to extend the flooded areas out towards Isigny on the eastern side of the Vire and Douve estuary. This is obviously going to have some effect on not only the Allies in terms of the airborne landings in this area, but it'll eventually have a big effect on German operations. We can jump ahead. This is a quick organizational chart of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. It basically has 3 battalions. They were thinking of creating a 4th battalion out of the separate companies, the anti-tank and mortar company. That didn't happen by the time of the Carentan battle. In May, when we see the figure here, it had about 3,500 men. My own belief is that it was probably stronger on D-Day, simply because they were trying to expand it out to a 4 battalion configuration. And the 3 battalion commanders are shown in the upper right. The figure in the upper left is Major Friedrich von der Heydt, who's the commander of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6.
Do you, just again, I like jumping in with questions. Do you think that von der Heydt, because he had been working in the law profession in the USA, he had lived there, he had American friends. I've read things that say that gave him a really good insight into kind of the American way of war. Do you think that's significant, or is it people making a mountain out of a molehill?
I think they're making a mountain out of a molehill. I don't think that, especially when he's confronting a U.S. airborne division, I don't think that contact with American culture really gives you much insight into the opponents that he's going to face. Maybe it does in a very broad sense, but there really hadn't been that much of an experience against U.S. airborne forces. Obviously, they were used in Sicily and at Salerno, but they were not full-scale, 2-division operations as would occur on D-Day.
Okay, thanks.
I'm just going to put this up for a moment. This compares for the 101st Airborne Division, the Allied protagonists in this battle, against Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6. The point that I'd mainly like to make here is the 101st has 3 parachute regiments, the 501, 2, and 506, and a glider infantry regiment, the 327th. The important point here is this is a shift from the immediate pre-D-Day organization, which tended to favor glider forces. But prior to D-Day, the division switched to a greater emphasis on parachute infantry regiments rather than glider. Size-wise, obviously 101st is larger than Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, but of course, Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 does get additional plus-ups from local units during the fighting. We can jump ahead. Okay, here's D-Day. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. It's a fairly complicated story. 101st is down in the lower half of that map. They're heading down towards Carentan. The blue lines show the major objectives of the 101st on D-Day. The most important objective, of course, is to secure the exits over the causeway leading off of Utah Beach. Because the Germans had flooded the areas, the causeways were critical. They were also supposed to deal with the 122 millimeter gun barrel at Saint-Martin. which they don't really do. It was actually simply obliterated by the RAF. They do go there, but by then it's just a smoking ruin. They are instructed to secure the locks, the Douve River locks at La Barquette. The reason being that this is part of the greater plan to make sure that they secure the Douve River to prevent any attacks against the Utah Beach from the south. Likewise, they're supposed to capture the bridges along the Douve River, the ones near Le Port and Brevant. So in any event, they do accomplish most of their missions, although there's enormous problems, partly large numbers of casualties. A lot of them are due to airborne accidents, people getting injured during the landings, missed drops. It's not popularly realized, but through the 12th of June, the day of the heavy fighting in Carentan, the 101st Airborne had suffered the highest casualties of any U.S. division in 5 or 7 Corps. And it's largely because there were large numbers of troops missing and large numbers injured during the airborne operation. Okay, we can jump ahead. We'll go to D+1. Okay, the battle for Carentan really starts on D+1 as the 101st Airborne is pushing out of their immediate D-Day objectives and moving down towards Carentan. The important thing to see on this map is the blue areas represent those flooded areas. Now, this is going to have a big effect on the way the fighting takes place because both the German and American sides are obliged to operate mostly on the drier areas. These are mostly towns or areas that are slightly elevated above the farmland. So, as I'll show in a moment, Saint-Condemont is in a slightly higher area around those marshes on either side of it, and so the fighting is going to be heavily centered around Saint-Condemont. Now, Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 on D-Day starts to send 2 of its battalions north out of the Carentan area. The 1st Battalion goes up towards Saint-Mer, towards the Utah Beach exits, whereas the 2nd Battalion is sent more towards Saint-Condemont. So you can see I haven't put up the arrows for the D-Day movements. I put them up for the D+1. Now, what happens on the American side is the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment pushes down a small road, the D913, or the road that's called D913 these days, through the very small villages of Vireville and Beaumont, aiming for the southern exit out of Saint-Condemont. They're really not aiming for the town of Saint-Condemont. They're simply trying to get access to the road network that goes down to Carentan, and also to link up with forces from the division that are already down along the Vire River. You can see down in the lower section of the map, you can see where Colonel Johnson has a small detachment down at the La Barquette locks. That's roughly 250 men. And Captain Shuttle has another detachment up near Le Port on the Douve River bridges. So the emphasis on D+1 is going to be to unify the various elements of the 101st Division to push down towards Carentan. Now, what ends up happening is that there's other German elements here. There's the 3rd Battalion of Grenadier Regiment 1058, which is one of the units from the 91st Luftland. They're down in the area called Les Drueries. So the 2nd Battalion of 501st is heavily engaged with them in that fight. What happens with Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, or the most dramatic effect on D+1 is the 1st Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 is very far north. It had been sent up there to try to block the Utah Beach exits. Has no luck at that because it's a relatively small unit compared to the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. During the course of the day, the battalion tries to unify itself with the 2nd Battalion of the regiment down around Saint-Condemont, but they're right in the midst of this enormous flood of U.S. troops, both from 4th Infantry Division and the 101st. What ends up later in the day, the 1st Battalion is that red symbol sort of on the right-hand side, the center right-hand side of the map there. And what happens is they try to escape over the Douve River back down towards Carentan because they realize that they can't get over to Saint-Condemont. What happens with them is they get engaged in 3 separate encounters. One of their companies gets caught up in the fighting near Vireville and Beaumont, basically gets wiped out. About half of them are captured, half killed. A small portion of the battalion encounters shuttles detachment down along the Douve River and basically surrenders. The large body from the battalion gets caught up with Johnson's forces down near the locks. And this ends up being a battle that takes place over 2 or 3 hours in the later part of the afternoon and the early evening of D+1. Johnson saw the 1st Battalion of German Fallschirmjäger coming down through the swamps and set up an ambush. He set up 6.30 caliber machine guns and some mortars. But Johnson's force was outnumbered. Johnson's force was probably a couple hundred paratroopers facing a German force that was probably more in the neighborhood of 500, 600 men. The German disadvantage is that they're in a flooded area. And once again, they get ambushed, they get shot up. There's 3 separate attempts by Johnson personally to encourage the Germans to surrender because it's hopeless. They don't, and there's a firefight that lasts well into the evening. And then finally, the Germans just give up. And so the 1st Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 is basically wiped out. Von der Hayden, in his memoir, says that probably only 25 men surrender, or survive, excuse me, and get down to Carentan. Now, what's happening in the meantime is that the other elements of the 506th have pushed down towards what we now call Dead Man's Corner, which is the road that leads out of Saint-Condamont. And the fighting ends there that day, with Saint-Condamont still in German hands, being held by the 2nd Battalion, elements of the 3rd Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, plus that battalion from 91st Luftland Division. So
just to jump in quickly, Steve, I always feel myself that sort of June the 7th and 8th period is where all the good of what the airborne had been doing on the first day has sort of been undone by the fact they're now in these little penny packets separated by floods and little pockets of Germans. So everything that was good about June the 6th, and I'm thinking about as far north as Ravenaville, where there's guys around the crossroads in Marmion Farm and Timmy's Orchard, east of the west of the Murderay River. But now, 2 days later, you've got to get all these little packets of people that have been doing a great job back into some sort of cohesive organization. And the Germans are now, sort of, as you've been explaining, in between the various American positions. There's floods in between, and there's a road network you've got to get to that is complicating matters. And I think, like we said at the beginning, that 48-hour period after D-Day, where it's all got to sort itself out again, is overlooked.
And there's some other interesting aspects to it too. One of them is the exhaustion on both sides. On the American side, it's the exhaustion because, of course, the paratroopers were supposed to drop a day before they did. And so a lot of those guys haven't had any sleep.
Yeah.
On the German side, it's not reported as often, but there's a couple of memoirs that mention it. The Fallschirmjäger had been given Pervitin, the methamphetamine stimulant. And some of the accounts mention the downside of that. It's great the first day, you're all jazzed up with Pervitin. But then by the end of the second day, everybody's, feeling the after effects of that. So on both sides, you're having this problem with exhaustion. And then the other issue is, and everybody who's familiar with the Normandy campaign knows the word bocage.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, both the Germans and the Americans were not that familiar with bocage fighting when this takes place on D+1. For the paratroopers, it's a new experience. This map doesn't show it very clearly, but that area is bocage country. There's little hedgerows all over the place. And so that affects things too. It's all these little small scale platoon size and company size skirmishes. These are not big maneuvers by battalions and regiments. This is all very, very small scale skirmishing, not large scale operations.
And the element of surprise has gone. I mean, that lasted for maybe even most of June the 6th. Certainly it lasted hours, but it's not a surprise anymore by June the 7th. Everyone now knows that all the pieces are on the chessboard, so to speak, and it's just a question now of making it sense and trying to get on with the jobs. But yeah, I'm thanks for that explanation. Been really good.
And D+1 is total confusion on both sides because you have intermixed forces. Nobody knows where everybody is. This is a photo that was taken a couple days after actually a couple weeks after the fighting. Saint-Condamont is up on that ridge that off on the horizon. You can see the town church over towards the right. This field would have been, parts of it would have been flooded on D+1, but it gives you a sense of why San Conoma was important, because it's up on an elevated ridge, and therefore it's not flooded like the lands around it. We can jump ahead. This is the town of San Conoma itself. There was actually not that much fighting in the town itself. Most of the fighting was south of the town. It would have been towards the bottom of the picture, and over to the right of the picture, that parallel road, the D913, where the 506 was pushing down on D+1 and D+2. But you can look at the terrain there, and it's classic bocage. You see all of the hedgerows all around it.
Yeah.
Okay, we can jump ahead. This is what the locks at La Barque look like. The locks are that those structures on the Douve River on the left-hand side of the photo. This whole area was flooded. This picture was taken in 1947 after the area had dried up, where the big fighting took place between Johnson's force and the 1st Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 was in the upper right. That whole area was flooded. The Germans were coming down sort of in that upper right corner where those roads join, and Johnson's forces were sort of in that area on some little outcroppings of dry land. But you can see this area is very, very flat, and once it starts to flood, it stays flooded. Yeah, we can jump ahead. And this is the other area that I mentioned. This is to the east of San Conoma, and this is where most of the fighting on D+1 took place. The road that you see over there on the left, that's the D913, and so this is specifically the ground where this fighting took place. Dead Man's Corner is not in this view. It would be down in the lower left of the picture if the view showed it. And we can jump ahead. This is the famous scene from Dead Man's Corner, and anybody who's been to the museum there will recognize the shot. A platoon of tanks from the 70th Tank Battalion was supporting the airborne. This particular M5A1 was knocked out by a Panzerfaust fired by one of the Fallschirmjäger, and a couple of the crewmen were left dead in the tank there for a few days, leading to its name. And the museum right now has a replica M5A1 sitting there. So this is kind of an iconic place for anyone traveling to the Carentan area.
And I always encourage people when they go there is just stop outside and look down that road to Carentan, because it sort of is like a chapter break, isn't it? It brings the kind of pushing off the beach part of the 101st Airborne story to an end, but begins that, and now you've got to go to Carentan. But while I've got you on that road to Carentan, one of the things I think I'm a bit confused about still is your book is entitled the linking up of the two beaches. Was there much written in advance about whether it was 5th Corps' responsibility from Omaha to get to Carentan first, or 7th Corps from Utah, or was it more like whoever's able to do it, as it unfolds? What's your take on that? Because we have Nixon in Band of Brothers saying, and at the briefing on the airfield, and it's always the mission to go to Carentan. But was it always earmarked for the 101st, or was it equally part of the 5th Corps and the 29th Division's objectives?
It was more the 101st's objective than it was the what would have essentially been the 29th Division, because they were over on the western side of 5 Corps. And the reason was more geography than anything else. 29th Division was expected to rapidly move out of the beach and capture all of those gun batteries over on the eastern side of the Vire and Douve estuary. The area around Grand Con, Maizy, and that area there. One of their road objectives, of course, was Isigny, which is on the road east of Carentan. The U.S. The instructions or the plans for the post D-Day thing are not super duper specific. There's expectations, like for D-Day, there was expectations that the 101st would reach as far as the Douve River. But quite honestly, if they reach those points on the Douve River, they're literally only thousands of yards from Carentan. Whereas the 29th Division is quite a bit further away. The other issue is, and we dealt with this when I gave a presentation for you a year or two ago on Pointe du Hoc, 29th Division gets very much caught up in the fighting over on that side of the river estuary, and that's why they don't get over here. I'm not going to go into that at all today. There's all sorts of complications over there.
Yeah. Thank you. Brilliant stuff.
And here's D+2. I'm not going to go into this in great detail. The battle is basically a continuation of D+1. Basically, 506 is given the assignment, reinforced with other elements from the division, to take Saint-Condoment as the precursor of taking Carentan. By this stage, Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 has brought up an additional 2 companies from the 3rd Battalion. They're down on the southern part of Saint-Condoment, mainly in the Dead Man's Corner area. 2nd Battalion is up in the town itself. So in any event, so the paratroopers start a concerted effort to take the town. By the later part of the morning, the 2nd Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 starts to pull out. The fighting in the later part of the afternoon mostly involves the 3rd Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 against various paratrooper elements. Now, the problem of the flooding starts to affect the Germans more greatly here, because when 2nd Battalion pulls out, they decide they're going to go down the railroad bridge down into Carentan. Now, the problem is that engineer elements from 91st Luftland have already blown one of the spans on the railroad bridge, creating a gap. Now, that's going to create a real big problem for 2nd Battalion because they're going to lose all their heavy equipment when they have to swim across the flooded areas. The second thing that happens is that Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 has most of its baggage train up at Saint-Condoment. When they retreat, they can't bring their baggage train with them, so they lose most of their ammunition. 3rd Battalion, the remaining element of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 that's up in Saint-Condoment, withdraws in the afternoon down along the road causeway, which we'll be talking quite a bit about in a moment. But even that area has problems because, once again, 91 Luftland Division, their engineers have blown one of the bridges down there. So the retreat of the Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 is very, very haphazard. It's very deleterious to their long-term abilities to resist the 101st Airborne, largely due to the loss of heavy weapons and ammunition. And 101st Airborne is hot on their heels. Now on the map, you can see Carentan. You can see that the distances are not that large, but there's plenty of geographic obstructions, the physical barriers of the rivers and the flooded areas.
It's interesting. Your opinion is that that map there with the shaded area representing the flooding, you can see that, Saint-Condoment for the Germans, I'm not going to say it's easy to defend, but it's got that kind of island, sort of a high ground you mentioned earlier on. It's sort of a logical place to defend. That seems to me the kind of place that weeks or months later would have been the kind of, that Hitler would say, do not leave that. That's kind of that fortress. And later on, they might have kind of died to the last round there. But at this point, a couple of days in, they're thinking about getting back somewhere else to defend again. There's a different mindset still. The Germans are playing a better game than perhaps they would later on. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I think it's partly because Berlin didn't have the type of tactical maps that they would have later on. They didn't know where the Allies were going to land. The standard German maps at the time typically were the 1 to 80,000 scale. I have one of the actual German maps from this area from 1944, and it doesn't show the flooded areas very well. So the perception in Berlin would probably not be focused on this fact that Saint-Condoment does represent a very good defensive position. If they looked at it simply on the maps, it just looks like any other little French town.
Very good point.
Yeah, so I think that affects their viewpoint to some extent. I don't want to call it an ignorance, but a lack of knowledge about the terrain in Berlin compared to the local commanders. Von der Heyd obviously appreciated that. I mean, he views Saint-Condoment as the centerpiece of his defense of Carentan. He doesn't just put his forces immediately in Carentan; he puts them in Saint-Condoment.
Okay.
So in any event, by the end of the 8th of June. The Germans haven't pushed out of Saint-Condoment, and now we get down to the fight for Carentan because 101st is now on the outskirts of the town and having to decide how they're going to approach it, because there's obviously multiple approach routes. They can go in through the north, they can go across the causeway, they can go across the railroad bridge. They have to decide which of these approach routes is the most feasible. Schaeff over in London actually comes out and says the best approach would be from the north. And I'll show with some photos in a moment why that's really not a great idea. The area is extremely broken up with water obstacles, and it's flooded. You can see on the map here it's flooded. The causeway the local commanders, especially the people from 101st Division, feel that the causeway is the best approach. It's relatively dry. There is a bridge blown, but it's a relatively dry way to get down there. The railroad bridge is in an area that's much more deeply flooded. That's a natural marsh in that area, and they have that big section of railroad bridge that had been knocked down. So the 101st is leaning towards using the causeway as the main approach, while at the same time having a secondary approach that's going to be assigned to the 327th Glider Infantry. So we can jump ahead. Here's the bridge that was knocked down on the railway embankment, and so this was a very significant obstacle. And on top of it, the area. This photo was taken several days after the fighting. You can still see that the area is very, very heavily flooded all around it. So this is the reason that that 101st decided not to go down the railway causeway. Here's a view of the area. We're looking from Carentan. This was taken by a small light plane in 1947, literally flying over Carentan and looking north. So Saint-Condoment is up there and sort of in the right center. You can see that little smear of buildings up there. That's Saint-Condoment up there. Dead Man's Corners on the main road leading down from it. The causeway that I keep talking about is the road that's coming straight down the middle of this photo. That's going to be the centerpiece of the battle. And then on the left-hand side is the railway causeway, which also leads into the city, but which was avoided during much of this fighting.
Brilliant photo. I hadn't seen that particular angle before, so that's really cool.
Yeah, that's from the Hatlam collection up at Army Heritage and Education Center. It's an excellent selection of photos that were taken in 1947, 1948, specifically to support the Green Book, the U.S. Army's official history. And surprisingly, it's not very well exploited. I don't think that most people are aware of it. So unfortunately, I'm not that far from there. So for this particular project, I went up there and made copies of the associated photos.
Brilliant.
Okay, so here's the problems on the causeway. There's 4 bridges on the way down there, and Paul was kind enough to send me some of these photos. The drawing in the upper right, it was by one of the paratroopers. It gives you a sense of what it was like to advance across the causeway. There's no cover there. So for any of you who have been over to the Carentan area recently and have walked or driven over the causeway, you'll know that it's tree lined. It's very scenic. It looks really nice. But during the war, during the days after D-Day, it was flooded on either side, and there was no coverage except for those stunted little poplar trees on either side. Now there's problems with the bridge. Bridge number 2, which is one of the 2 bridges up closer to Saint-Condoment, towards Dead Man's Corner, that bridge had been knocked down. Bridge number 4, which is the bridge that is closest to Carentan and which is going to be the centerpiece of the fighting, we see in this picture down here. Now, it was not blown up, but what had happened was the Germans had put a Carentan obstacle, also called a Belgian gate, for any of those of you who know the D-Day's story about all the obstacles on the beach. This was a 1940 Belgian border fortification that the Germans used in Normandy as coastal obstructions. But the Germans had taken one of those things and stuck it on bridge number 4, completely blocking it. And so what happens when 101st gets down there, they try to shove it away, but the thing weighs almost 1.5 tons. And they're able to make a small gap to get people through one at a time. But that becomes a major problem when 101st tries to send the 502nd down the causeway to get to the outskirts of Carentan.
Just a bit of an aside, years ago, and I met Alexander Ullig, who was a captain of the 6th Fellowship, and a couple of the guys with him. Among the veterans I met, they used to refer to bridge number 2, the blown up one, as Gonneman's Bridge, after Alexander Gonneman, the guy they said was the guy who blew it up, who apparently, according to them, had emigrated to Canada, I think it was, after the war. They were brothers. There was 2 Gonnemans. One died in Crete or something, and one fought in Normandy. But it's one of those things that, you hear those stories, but there's no real corroboration of it. But that's what they said to me. So Gonneman's Bridge is kind of in my head, I call it that.
Well, the problem is that there's very few archival records for Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6. What does exist is veteran accounts, like in the Greiser book, The Lions of Carentan, and there's about 3 accounts by von der Heydt about it, but von der Heydt's accounts are very spotty. there's portions of the fighting which are very, very well detailed, and there's other parts where he hardly mentions them at all. And part of it is that he probably simply wasn't aware of what was going on.
Yeah.
You know, he didn't have the best radio communications. One of the reasons that his first battalion gets wiped out on D+1, there's no radio communications. So they're having
Yeah.
a great deal of time coordinating. We can
Yeah.
jump ahead one more.
Hang on. There we go.
Okay, here's another picture of the causeway taken from a slightly different angle. Number 6 up at the upper left is St. Connemara. Number 1 is roughly Dead Man's Corner, also bridge number 1. 2 is bridge number 2, 3 is bridge number 3, and then 4 is bridge number 4. Now, what we have at 5 is going to become the centerpiece of the fighting, the first bit of fighting in Carentan. It's called Repelling, or it's more commonly called the Inguf Farm after the people who lived there. But that is going to become the centerpiece of the defense of the 3rd Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6. And what's going to happen is that the 502nd, the company that heads down towards bridge number 4, is going to be slowly but surely getting their way down there in that one day, but having an awful time doing it because, as you can well imagine from the distances that you can see here, that causeway is completely exposed to German small arms fire.
Yeah.
So the path to get down, and it's sometimes called Purple Heart Causeway for that reason, because it just takes them such a long period of time to get down there. They're being so cautious to get down there. And then, of course, you know, the areas on either side are flooded. So there's no way they can outflank this defense. They're basically forced to make their way very, very gingerly down there. Now, the other problem is we can't see it here, but the 2nd Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 is over on the far right of where this picture is. So that battalion can fire on the causeway as well. Mm. Now, the Fallschirmjäger had also taken all of their surviving artillery and stuck it down on the south side of Carentan, which is an easy range of all of this battlefield. They still have a fair number of mortars, 81 millimeter mortars, and a small number of artillery pieces. So this area is very, very exposed to German artillery fire, small arms fire, and machine gun fire.
I just want to say that one of my favorite places that I haven't been there for a while is that reverse L-shape hedgerow in the bottom left corner there, which you can walk down there, which is one of those big, like 8-foot, 10-foot high earth bank. And if you pick your way to the top of that and you look across, and you can, as you said there are now more trees on the causeway, but it's ducks in a shooting gallery from that position there. It's just that perfect range for even, you know, rifle fire, but, you know, stick an MG42 or 34 or even an FG42 in there, and you can imagine the ease with which they're able to. And as I say, add the artillery coming from the town, add the other Fallschirmjäger positions off to the right of the photo. I mean, there was a lot of fire coming in from a lot of directions, right. Unfortunately. Yeah,
there were between 4 and 6 MG42s in that hedgerow line over to the left-hand side of the farm. And strangely enough, one of the other weapons that was in that hedgerow line was a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun. I don't know where the Fallschirmjäger got it, but they had a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, and they were popping away down there. I didn't know that. Yeah. They also had a 75 millimeter anti-tank gun down that road. If you follow the causeway down into Carentan, there was a 75 millimeter anti-tank gun right on that road. If you see the little number 4 on the photo there, it was to the right, to the lower right of that number 4.
Thank you.
So they had plenty of stuff to shoot. Yeah, let's jump ahead. This is just a close. Yeah, that's just a close up of the farm. We can go to the next one immediately.
Yeah. It's sad that that farm now, that the recent owners a couple of years ago have plastered over the front there where the bullet holes were, which is a little bit annoying. There's still some around the back on the brick bit, but it's, you know, it was one of those places I'd always pass that and go, oh, look at the bullet holes on there. And it came up for, I'm going off the massive woody rabbit hole down there, but that place came up for sale about 15 years ago, and I was tempted to get that. The downside is you're in a great place for history, but there's a sewage processing plant like literally next door. I don't know that I wanted to be living next to where the sewage trucks come in and out when I'm having a nice barbecue in the garden. So never did look into buying it. But anyway, back to you.
Yeah, it's very rural in 1944, as we can see here. This is the view the paratroopers would have seen, you know, when they were facing the farm. But the situation today is completely different, as Paul knows very, very well. It's much, much more built up. So we can jump ahead to the next slide. This is Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole. He's leading the 3rd Battalion of the 502nd, who's assigned to the mission of pushing across into Carentan. His assignment is actually to push all the way down to Hill 30, which is the hill south of the railroad station that's located on the south side of Carentan. That is not going to happen because of the intensity of the fighting. This is a very detailed map. I'm not going to go into all of it, but basically what happens is first thing on the morning of the attack, Cole decides that the only way to do this is simply to stage a run from bridge number 4 over to the farm and seize the farm and overcome the German defenses. So first he calls in a smoke from the artillery. He has a battalion of self-propelled M7 105 howitzers supporting him. He didn't have as many 75 millimeter airborne pack howitzers as he normally would have had because they were lost during the landing operation. But in any event, so he calls in smoke, and the smoke is dropped somewhat behind the farm, trying to isolate the farm and the German defenses immediately in the farm area from all of those hedgerows that Paul was talking about. If you look in sort of the upper left center, all that red stuff, red 1, red 2, those are the MG 42 positions. All those pointing arrows are all MG 42s. So you get some sense of the amount of firepower that the Germans had available in a very, very small place. But in any event, so 6:30 rolls around. Cole tells everybody, okay, we're going to make a bayonet charge. He starts up with a bayonet charge down that road. He looks behind him, and instead of having 100 or 200 paratroopers behind him, he has about 20 guys behind him. The instructions have not been clearly understood because everybody around the bridge was all scattered in little groups because of all the small arms fire and artillery that they're encountering. So his executive officer, Major Stopka, rounds up a bunch of the other guys, and they start building up the force behind him. So the bayonet charge eventually involves about 150 paratroopers charging the farm. They get down to the farm, they kick open the door. There's no Germans left in the farm, but detachments from the paratroopers start pushing off down into the hedgerows, to clear out the Fallschirmjäger that were still there. A lot of the Fallschirmjäger simply pull back. They can appreciate the fact they're about to be overwhelmed. So there's a bit of hiatus in the fighting by midday, simply because the Germans have pulled back a bit, and the paratroopers are just trying to recover from the losses suffered around the bridge. At the same time, another battalion from 502nd is sent down across the causeway to reinforce the attack. They are also assigned to take Hill 30. But what happens in the meantime is that the 2nd Battalion of Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, largely on their own initiative, not even under von der Heydt's command, they see what's happening. They would have been over on the right side of this map, a little bit over on the eastern side. They come charging up the main road out of Carentan and counterattack the paratroopers. So the fighting goes on through the remainder of the afternoon, from roughly noontime through the middle of the afternoon. It becomes very, very desperate. There's some debate on both sides, both from the paratroopers and the Fallschirmjäger, whether they're going to have to withdraw. Now, what's happening in the background that isn't widely appreciated is the Germans had already decided that Carentan was absolutely essential, and Rommel assigns 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division to a counterattack at Carentan. Now, those guys are all the way down south in a small town. For any of you who know where Saumur is, the French Cavalry School and the museum, they're down past the Loire Valley. They start moving on DDay up towards Carentan. But the movement is very, very slow. They don't have enough trucks. The trains that are taking some of their heavy equipment get strafed by Allied fighter bombers. So they were supposed to start their counterattack the afternoon of this fighting. And von der Heydt had been told that by his corps commander. He was told, we're going to start a counterattack around 1500 hours that day. Now, what happens is that at 1500 hours that day, his 2nd Battalion is counterattacking. His 3rd Battalion has been almost wiped out. One of the companies suffered over 100 casualties this day alone. There's no sign of 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. He sees no evidence of it. So his guys are overwhelmed. They're almost out of ammunition. It got so bad that they took all of the 7.9 millimeter ammunition that the Fallschirmjäger riflemen had, collected it all in order to feed the MG42s, which they viewed as being more important. So a lot of the Fallschirmjägers, the only thing they had is, if they had a pistol, they had a pistol, or they might have like an MP40 because it fires pistol ammunition. So they were in very desperate shape. So so von der Heydt goes to his 2 battalion commanders and said, "Okay, guys, do you think we can hold on?" And one commander says, maybe, maybe, maybe. And the other guy says, no, no way. We've suffered too many casualties. We're out of ammunition. There's no way we can hold this position, and there's certainly no way we can hold the town. And so von der Heydt, around 1600 hours, about an hour after the counterattack was supposed to take place, he just says, okay, we're pulling out. And the plan is to withdraw down into Hill 30, which is the area immediately south of Carentan. It's called Hill 30. That sounds really impressive. It's not really that elevated. But
it's a bump.
Yeah, there's hedgerows and stuff, but it's not, you know, you hear hill and you immediately think of, you know, like a plateau or something. I've got a picture coming up. We'll see what it looks like. But in any event, so von der Heydt decides around 1600 to pull out. So the paratroopers finally overcome some rear guard, but they do not get into Carentan this day. It won't be till the day after, on the 12th, when they actually get into Carentan proper.
Well, we had a question, which is a question I used to get when I was there on tours all the time, and Ian was the today did it, is aerial support. You know, when I've been standing, you know, near bridge number 4 and talking about Cole pushing down there, pistol in his hand, etc., etc., people say, why didn't they, you know, whistle up a couple of P-47s to strafe the hell out of that? Why couldn't they bring up a couple of P-51s? I'll put that question to you.
I haven't found the divisional records for the calls for airstrikes. I know that they called airstrikes on a couple of occasions, mostly to attack bridges. They do not appear to have had any calls for air support for this particular mission. And to be quite honest, I think the reason for it is they seriously underestimated the German garrison in Carentan.
Yeah.
So if you look at the G2 reports from at regimental level, not G2, but S2, you see that they estimate that the Germans only have a single battalion in Carentan. And so the assumption is that, yeah, they're taking heavy casualties near bridge number 4, but there's only a German battalion in there and pretty weak. And so we're going to be able to punch in there pretty easily. Now, the other thing that I haven't discussed at all yet is that the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, while this is happening, is up on the north side, pushing into Carentan from the north side. So the U.S. assessment is there's only a battalion of Germans there. Cole's unit is pushing in here down the causeway. 327th is pushing in from the north side, and at the same time, some elements of the 29th Division from over with 5 Corps are pushing into the eastern side of Carentan. So the general assumption is they're just going to kick in the door and jump in.
Yeah.
They don't appreciate that Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 is, number one, larger than they expected, and number two, it's an extremely good unit. It's a very determined unit, and they do have reinforcements. They have elements of Grenadier Regiment.
That's pretty much my take on it. And you know that only kind of halfway down the causeway, when they're under the fire, do they really realize how much firepower is coming up. I would also add a little bit of Robert Cole's personality there, in that he hasn't really had a chance to have a decent fight yet. You know, the gun batteries that the 50 Deuce were supposed to taken out ended up having been knocked out before the Germans had run away. He's probably heard of units of the 506 knocking out gun batteries, some units of the 501st seizing things. I feel he wants to, you know, I'm not criticizing him, as we'll find out. He's an incredibly brilliant soldier, but I feel he's really keen to get in and do some killing, which is essentially his job.
And he had a problem there. I mean, he had a clear flat area between his location on bridge number 4 and the immediate tactical objective, which was that farm building. You know, how do you take it? You can't outflank it because of the flooding. Yeah. You simply can't outflank it. You've got basically one bit of dry land. You're going to have to charge across that dry land.
Yeah, I've stood there with ICOM.
Yeah, he calls for smoke. He calls for artillery support. And then he says, okay, we just got to do it this way.
I've stood there with I Company veterans, G Company veterans, even a B Company guy, Tony Lewin. All of them would have, run through walls for Robert Cole. None of them, even years later, when some of their friends died on that run, they all were like, yeah, we wanted to go. There was confusion, as you said there, that sometimes they didn't all hear the order. There was a bit of a sort of snafu situation, but that they all wanted to go in there and kick the door down and kill Germans. That's who they were. And they were proud of having that spirit. They were proud of Cole having his, ancestry going back to Texas Rangers. He was a son of a bitch, and I mean that in a complimentary way. And I think that has to have an impact on the mood as well.
Yeah, the other thing to point out here for viewers who aren't aware of it, Cole is the only member of the 101st Airborne who receives the Medal of Honor.
Yeah,
for the Normandy actions. The division basically decides. There are numerous nominations for Medal of Honor, but Taylor basically decides they're only going to give out one Medal of Honor, and the choice was fairly straightforward. So Cole is the one who receives the Medal of Honor.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, I was mentioning a moment ago the configuration of Carentan. This is a view from the south of the town, looking at Hill 30. The center of this picture is Hill 30. This was where Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 fell back into. It was heavily flooded, especially over on the right-hand side. Now, if you look in the upper sort of right side, you see that waterway with stuff around it. That's the basin up there. It's kind of a little port on the northern side of Carentan. So that's where the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment is coming. And the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment is coming down on the left side, the part of the town that's over on the left side in this picture. So this is just kind of an aerial view of what's going to happen the following day when Carentan itself is attacked. And this is what's happening on the northern side. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but this is what 327th was doing. They went across on the Douve River, sort of in the center picture that you see there towards Brevant, and then came down trying to skirt around that flooded area. This map doesn't show it, but there were also elements of 327th and 401st that came down the river itself on either side of the basin. So this map isn't entirely complete, but that's what's happening on the north side of the town. We tend to focus on what happens on the causeway simply because it's a much more dramatic battle. The fighting on the north side of town, it doesn't see a lot of confrontation between 101st and the Germans.
No, indeed.
We can jump ahead. This is the basin I just mentioned. Carentan is in the upper part of that picture, so we're looking southward. And so this is where elements of 327th to 401st were coming down to enter the northern part of Carentan on the 12th.
And I just want to pay a personal tribute to George Mullins of the 327th, who was over here in Normandy, just gone back a couple of days. I've known him for years, and he always feels that his role is coming in that northern way. And he said, I lost count of how many bloody rivers and tributaries we crossed over those few hours there. But he always felt that, the 50 Deuce and the 506th and had got a bit more of the credit. So here's to you, George. You're a superstar in my eyes.
Well, you know what happened is that when they did the combat interviews of 101st Airborne immediately after the fighting, they didn't interview 327th and 401st.
No.
And so there's extensive detail on the 3 parachute infantry regiments, but there's no coverage at all of 327th, 401st. And there's only that one tiny little battery press, or actually unit history of the glider infantry. So yeah, they don't get the coverage that the other units. There's a few autobiographies, but unfortunately, practically all the autobiographies are by guys who got wounded early in the campaign. So, they get into D1, D2, they're wounded, they're pulled out. So there's very little coverage of the 327th, 401st during the actual capture of Carentan on the 12th.
Yeah, definitely. Brilliant.
Okay, yeah, we can jump ahead one more. This is the final fighting on the 12th. The 502nd was assigned to their mission to go down to Hill 30, but 502nd demurred and said, we've really taken so many casualties. Could we bow out and send in a fresher unit? So they send in the 506th. Now, people who watch Band of Brothers will be aware of that because 2nd Battalion 506 is actually the element of 506 that's sent into the town from the south. And so Easy Company, Winter's Company, goes into the southern part of Carentan, as is shown in the TV series. And you can see the arrows up there. G Company from 327th goes in on one side of the basin, and A Company of 401st Glider Infantry goes on the other side. The most intense fighting is actually by 501st. 501st
Yeah.
swings way around the city, and comes up from the eastern side and gets sent across the flooded area to the southeast of the city. Now, the sad or the difficult thing is that number one, that area is very, very heavily flooded. And number two, the Germans have set up all their 20 millimeter flak guns on that Hill 30 facing down in that area. So 501st has an awful time crossing that flooded area against the flak guns. And they finally overwhelmed them. But of all the fighting on that day, that was by far the worst. The end of the story is the end of the 12th. Carentan has been captured. The U.S. troops enter the town. This is, in fact, a photo from the 327th. This is from a relatively obscure photo collection up at AHEC up at Carlisle. It hasn't been widely seen.
Yeah, I'd not seen that one. That was a new one. I for a moment I thought it was even like a modern reenactor one, because I did a Carentan video a few years ago, and I thought I'd found every photo of the 101st. So my initial was, that's a reenactor one, and I realized no, it isn't. It's just one you'd found that I hadn't seen. So great.
It's actually part of a series of negatives, and the reason it's not known is when you go into the photo file, there's no prints. In fact, I was talking to the guys at Carlisle, and they were saying they weren't aware of it because for some reason they never made prints to go along with the negs. And so the staff up there was kind enough to let me copy on a light table. So I copied all of the negs that were there, and it's part of a series. There's a good dozen shots from 327, 401st in that collection.
Brilliant stuff.
But the negatives are there, not down in National Archives. As compared to this is a very well-known shot from 506. Well, actually, the Jeep and the anti-aircraft, or the 6-pounder, are actually from the anti-aircraft / anti-tank battalion of the division. But this shot is well known because it's in the Signal Corps collection down at Nara.
Yeah.
We can jump ahead. Okay, next day. So I mentioned a moment ago that Rommel had gotten 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division to stage a counterattack at Carentan. The first elements of the division arrived in the Carentan area late on the 12th. They were supposed to stage the attack starting at 1500. Doesn't happen. So they decide they're going to stage the attack the following day, 13th of June, 1944. They don't have the entire division up there, not by a long stretch. What they have nearest to Carentan is one battalion from the Panzer Grenadier Regiment 37. They have their Panzer Regiment, which, contrary to the name, isn't equipped with tanks, but it's equipped with Stug 4 assault guns, which we see here in this illustration. They have elements of their Panzerjäger Abteilung, and they have miscellaneous other units. They have some artillery and that sort of thing. So they decide that they're going to stage the attack first thing on the morning of the 13th, supported by the survivors from Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6, which at this time numbers probably around 1,000, 1,200 men out of its original roughly 4,000 men. So it's been reduced to about a quarter of its strength. Now, one thing to point out, because I suspect that most viewers have seen this episode on Carentan in Band of Brothers. Band of Brothers, it happens in nice weather. The German counterattack actually takes place in absolutely dismal pouring rain. So, the battle that you see on TV is not the battle that was actually fought. Everybody who wrote accounts about this battle just say absolutely miserable day. So in any event, so let's go to the map because it gives a clear view. Oh, the Germans actually did shoot a little bit of film footage. There's no stills that I know from this battle, but there was a German combat cameraman who actually did get a little bit of footage. So this is a screen capture from some German footage that was taken that day. Okay, so here's another map. You can see Carentan in the upper right. The Fallschirmjäger were assigned on the upper left flank up on the north. Quite honestly, very near where they were fighting. The farm building where they're fighting is sort of in the center top. You can see the town name. The main German attack is that one in the center, the 1st Battalion of Panzer Grenadier Regiment 37. That's going to go straight up the route, or straight up the road, the N803 straight towards the railroad station. And then there was one company from the other battalion, the 6th Company of the 2nd Battalion, that's attacking further to the south. And both of those attacks have a single company of Stug 4s supporting them. So there's a fair amount of armor. Now, what's also curious is that this attack takes place while 101st Airborne is supposed to be launching an attack. It's actually a meeting engagement. It's not actually Germans attacking a defense position. They're actually attacking elements of the 101st Airborne Division while they themselves were staging an attack. But it's an extremely confused attack because, number one, the weather's awful. The area is still flooded. It's full of bocage. Neither side quite understands what's going on. The people who get hit the worst is F Company, the 506th,
Yep.
Who Band of Brothers is constantly complaining about because they withdraw. Well, they were hit pretty much full strength by an entire Panzer Grenadier battalion supported by armor.
Absolutely, on 3 sides, and they knock out at least 2 vehicles before they pull out. And
Right.
I get so grumpy when people go, "Did F Company run away?" I go, "Did they fuck?"
They got hit by the brunt of the attack. So
Yeah,
that's what
absolutely.
happened. And they pull back 150 yards. They don't. Everybody says, "Oh, they're back in Carentan." No, they're not. They pull back 150 yards and
They
reestablish.
regroup. Yeah.
By 9:30, 3 hours later, the Germans are saying the attack is hopeless. So so the paratrooper defenses hold. Now down in the south, they're facing that one company's facing elements of the 501st. They get stopped cold. They just don't go anywhere. Now the curious thing about this whole attack, and I'm going to get into it in a little bit more detail in a minute. What had happened the night before is that the folks over at Bletchley Park are listening in on German radio communications. Now, Bletchley Park has no access to German Army or Waffen-SS communications channels because the Army and the Waffen-SS don't use radio. They use teletype or they use landlines or whatever, but they don't go on the air with radio. Now, the problem is that the Luftwaffe does use radio. And so what happens on the afternoon of the 12th, the day before this attack, is that the Luftwaffe, their FLIVO, the FLIVO is the liaison officer who's assigned to various of the units. The 17th SS had a FLIVO, and 84 Corps, the German 84 Corps has a FLIVO. These guys are up on the net talking and saying, well, we're going to stage a counteroffensive, and we need Luftwaffe air support for our offensive on the 13th of June. Well, Bletchley Park hears this and contacts 5 Corps and 7 Corps and says, hey, you guys better watch out. You've got elements of 17th SS Panzer Grenadier who are going to stage an attack on the 13th. Now, there's going to be some confusion about this because that night around midnight, Bradley contacts 5 Corps and says, hey, you guys have Combat Command A of 2nd Armored Division, which is really the only mobile formation that 1st U.S. Army has. He says, take elements, 1 battalion of tanks, 1 battalion of armored infantry, send them over to Carentan to help out to rebuff this German counterattack. But there's confusion that night. And let's jump to the other map and I'll explain what the confusion is. Well, actually, that's a picture of what happens. We can keep skipping. These are just pictures of the fighting. Here's Combat Command A. It's an M5 Stuart going through Carentan that day. Let's jump ahead. Here's the map. Okay, so Combat Command A, 2nd Armored Division is way over near Isigny. So they form a little battle group. They have 2 battalions of tanks, a battalion of armored infantry. Now, in the meantime, 29th Infantry Division, led by a familiar figure from anybody who knows Omaha Beach, General Norman Coda. Coda's over in this neighborhood. Now, Coda that night is over sort of on the very far right side of this map, and he's observing the Germans operating there, and he sees the Germans pulling into a small town there and radios back to divisional headquarters and says 150 German troops have entered the town of such and such. And 5 Corps, for some ungodly reason, misinterprets the radio message to say 150 tanks.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is that Bradley's 1st U.S. Army suddenly says, okay, we've been told that there's going to be a 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division attack. Now we get a message from Coda that there's 150 German tanks down on the east side of Carentan in the neighborhood. So they tell CCA 2nd Armored Division to hold up immediately north because they assume that the German tank attack is coming down on the far eastern side of the town of Carentan. Okay, so dawn breaks and there's no fighting there. And so CCA sends some guys down to meet Colonel Harper, the commander of the elements of 327th Glider there, and says, Colonel, we've got 2 battalions of tanks and a battalion of armored infantry and some self-propelled guns, and we're ready to support you in your defense of this town. And Harper looks at him and says, what are you people talking about? We have no German activity down here. Yeah, I mean, we're in contact, but there's no evidence of any major German action. Now, of course, in the meantime, they suddenly get all these frantic calls from 101st Airborne that the Germans are going nuts on the west side of Carentan. So they realize there's been a snafu. And so the combat command gets everybody back together. They send the tanks down the road. They arrive on the outskirts, the eastern outskirts of Carentan, around 10:30, by which time 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division has already been stopped by the paratroopers. But in any event,
they've been blunted, haven't they?
They've been blunted. They're not moving. It's a stalemate. Both sides, they're in the bocage. It's raining like hell. They're still fighting, but they're not going anywhere. So in any event, CCA decides to launch a 3-prong attack using 1 battalion on the north side, another battalion down on the southern side. And you can see it in the map here. Not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically they arrive in the afternoon. They arrive roughly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They start pushing ahead. The paratroopers jump on board the tanks. They start pushing down. By this stage, the German troops are both badly, they've suffered a lot of wounded. They've lost most of their small unit commanders. They're running out of ammunition. They're in a total state of disarray. They get pushed back beyond their start line. They get pushed back about 4 kilometers from the original start line. So in any event, by the end of the 13th, even though it started out with the Germans having high hopes that they were going to recapture Carentan, by the end of the day, they've been pushed back. And that's as far as they'll ever get to Carentan.
I'm so glad you cleared up that whole mystery about CCA and Second Armor, because that's confused the hell out of me for years. Because I mean, I remember buying the regimental history of the division, and there was like half a page on the entire June the 13th. It didn't answer any questions. It just gave more questions, because it explains why the delay took place. There was a genuine. I think it was Martin and Lagrange Kota was out.
It was. That's exactly. That was town. I didn't mention it because you can't see it on the map.
But. Yeah, and that hello Second Armor when Nixon does. There's so much more context to it, of, as you say, a situation that is a bit confused. And it goes back to that comment I said earlier about those intriguing days of June the 11th, 12th, 13th. This is the same day that Villa Bocage is happening for British 7th Armored. There's the same day that they're fighting for Breville Ridge over on the 6th Airborne sector. It's that the 29th, they're pushing across the River into the flooded area beyond. It's a really interesting time where there's penetrations being made, but there's a hell of a lot of confusion going on.
And it gets back to this problem with Ultra. You couldn't use Ultra until the mid-1980s.
Yeah.
And most of the earlier, an awful lot of our Normandy histories were written back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. None of the senior commanders could mention the fact that they had all this Ultra decrypt stuff coming in.
Good
so
point.
there were always kind of hints, well, we sort of knew that the Germans were doing something, blah, 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 blah. But they couldn't come right out and say, we had information that this German attack was going to happen, so we got our tanks revved up and started sending the tanks over there. So it's only now that you can go and look at the Ultra decrypts that you can understand what's going on the Allied side, as far as, well, why was Second Armored in the neighborhood that day? It wasn't coincidental. They were there for a reason. But the double surprise is, well, why weren't they in Carentan itself if they knew that they were going to be attacked on the western side? Well, the reason is for this snafu, this incident that happened with General Kota. So it adds that little extra added confusion for the nature of the fighting.
Brilliant stuff.
And we go one more. This is basically the consolidated lodgment. The important thing about Carentan is that it represents the end of the Normandy landings from the Allied perspective, especially the American perspective, but from the Allied perspective in general, it seals off that one last gap there. There was concern from Eisenhower's standpoint and Bradley's standpoint that Carentan was a weak point, that the Germans might try to exploit it. And they, in fact, did. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier attack was an attempt to exploit that weak point. So this is 12th to 13 June. I think there's one last map. There's the German perspective. There's 7 Corps, in the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. They're on the verge of making their drive north up to Cherbourg, which is their main operational objective. But you can see all of our various players down there, although quite honestly, it's kind of hard to read on this map because it's basically all handwritten. But this is the state of the campaign at the end of the 13th of June, 1944.
And brilliantly presented, as everyone's been saying in the sidebar. And it's interesting that we were talking about this before going live, is that all the effort to take Carentan, but actually southwest of it, the front line doesn't really shift for another 6 weeks or so, because lots of other things have to fall into place before the push can go. So that road down, after I take my tour groups there in April and October, you drive down the road from Carentan to Paris, you drive it in 20 minutes, but you're talking about a month of Normandy battle timeline. It's just, just it's that stating of the weirdness of how the Normandy campaign progresses. But I have one question. I thought it might have come up for earlier, and I'm looking to see you do a raised eyebrow look. But a lot has been said about the reason the 17th SS didn't get to Carentan earlier is because they're delayed. 2 regiments are delayed. 2,000 men knocked out, killed, wounded at the Battle of Grania. On the hilltop there. What's your take on that? I mean, I think it's bollocks, basically.
It is. That's another regiment. It's Panzer Grenadier Regiment 38.
Exactly.
It's not 37. The real reason that they have a hard time getting up there is that 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division is not a fully formed division. It began to form later part of 43, early part of 44. It's very, very short of 2 critical elements. Number one, leadership. It's only got roughly half of its NCOs and officers, and as you can well appreciate, in a brand new division, not having your officer cadre and your leadership cadre is a real big problem. The second problem is, even though it's called a Panzer Grenadier Division, it's not motorized at all. About the only thing that it has a full complement of is passenger cars. The sort of thing that officers would use or that staff would use, that sort of thing. As far as trucks are concerned, it's very, very understrength. I didn't put the charts up, but you can go on the Bundesarchiv site. Bundesarchiv actually has a lot of good material on 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. But anyway, you can see how many trucks they had, and they were very, very short trucks. So to give you an idea, that regiment that does go up to attack Carentan, the 37th, that one, of the 3 battalions, 1 battalion has trucks, and they don't have a full complement of trucks. They have about 50 trucks. 1 battalion has confiscated French trucks driven by French drivers, and the French drivers drag their feet. I mean, whenever you read the German accounts, all they talk about is how difficult it was dealing with the French drivers, who always came up with excuses for having to stop and check the radiators and check the fuel, blah, 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 blah. And then a third of the regiment had to get up there on bicycles. So the first company that gets up there actually goes from the Saumur area all the way up there on bicycles from D-Day until the 12th of June. They're riding bicycles up through the French countryside. So the real reason is the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division lacks mobility. Now, some of the division, especially the heavy stuff, the Panzer Regiment, they go up by rail. But everybody who's familiar with Normandy knows what the Allies are doing. They're going and bombing the hell out of all the rail lines. Well, one of the trains that's going up there actually is directly attacked by Allied fighter bombers. They lose at least 1 Stug 4. They lose at least 1 Marder tank destroyer. Plus the train, there's derailed trains and everything's all disrupted. So the railroad doesn't end up being a very effective way of moving it up into Normandy.
Thank you very much. That's a perfect answer. Just one from Jason over in Canada there, who's a major and has been on our channel talking about urban warfare. He's obsessed by urban warfare. Was there any urban fighting within Carentan? If so, can Mr. Zaloga recommend any good resource to discuss it? I mean, you kind of said earlier on is that the 506th and on the 12th. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a mopping up operation, but it's not quite. It's not like Aachen. It's not Stalingrad, is it?
No, there's no real urban fighting. On the northern side, where the 327th comes in, where I had that picture, there's practically no fighting at all. Yeah. Von der Heydt ordered his troops out. There were not. Yeah. He didn't set up any specific rearguard. Now, if you read Ambrose claims that there was a company left behind as a rearguard. That's not true. At that stage, Fallschirmjäger Regiment 6 was badly understrength. Yeah. They couldn't rely on the 2 Ost battalion that they had. They had some elements of the 1058. They really needed everything that they had down south to reestablish defenses. All that the Germans will say is that there were stragglers left behind in town. I mean, you can imagine from what I described there that, you couldn't communicate with everybody because everybody didn't have radios. So there were some Germans left behind in the town. Now, the TV version, the Band of Brothers depiction, is a major firefight. But I've seen no evidence on the German side that there was anything like that. I'm sure that the Company E did encounter something. They encountered a machine gun.
Yeah,
I don't know how many men they encountered. There was some fighting. They certainly got shelled because the Germans had a lot of mortars and stuff down on Hill 30, very, very close. So yeah, they got shelled and everything, but the amount of fighting inside the town was, I suspect, a lot less than the TV production.
I think it's that perception thing, isn't it? From E Company's point of view, who were at the vanguard of Second Battalion, they were dealing with what there was that was there. So yes, they are getting people wounded, and Tipper got wounded in the face and things like that. So they are absolutely encountering German firepower. But when you kind of zoom back the lens and look at the situation in terms of the divisional envelopment, it makes the Easy Company action seem a little bit smaller in that sense. But yeah, it's but yeah, you're right. It's what there was quite intense, but it wasn't on the scale that perhaps the series conveys.
One other detail I'll throw in is there's still some surviving mysteries about Carentan, because the German accounts talk on several occasions about having fights with the paratroopers on odds and ends days that don't show up in any of the American accounts. And I think it was, paratroopers were dropped south of the city, that sort of thing. Like the Germans talk on a couple of occasions about fights down on the railroad station, before the fighting on the 12th and 13th, and wiping out these paratrooper detachments that fought their way into town. So there probably was some scattered fighting in the outskirts of Carentan before, these main fights on the 12th and 13th. But we don't know a lot about them because they were these small paratrooper detachments. They were cut off from the main body. And in many cases, the Germans basically say they were wiped out. So we don't know about them. So there are some lingering mysteries.
Brilliant stuff. Well, Steve, it's been fantastic talking to you. We'll do it again at some point, folks. I'm back tomorrow with Norma Graham talking about the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, who are up to their necks in things this same time 81 years ago. As always, click like and subscribe. Find my guest books, buy their books, so they will write more books, and it all works out from there. So thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thank you, everybody, for your comments, and thank you, Steve, for a cracking presentation. I'll see you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.